Okay, we're all set. So what I'll do right now is I'll do the antitrust part, and then Dave, I'll hand over to you if that's okay.
Yeah, that sounds real good. Thank you.
Perfect. So everyone joining this call, welcome. This is one of the OpenChain meetings. This is the AI study group. This meeting, as with all OpenChain meetings, is held under the Linux Foundation Antitrust Policy Notice. You'll find a link to the full antitrust policy in our slides here. And if you're from a member company, you can ask any questions of our counsel, Andy Updegrove. Now, this meeting had a pre-socialized agenda. I've just put it up here to show where we're going. This meeting will be led by Dave Marr, one of the co-chairs of this study group. The other is Matthew Crawford from ARM. And Dave is going to be leading us through 3 points, a recap of discussion so far, a discussion about scoping, and then use cases. And obviously, everyone should be very free to raise questions, topics, and share ideas. This is, after all, a study group, and it is your domain to take this topic forward. Dave, do you want me to operate the slides while you talk, or do you want to share your screen?
Yes, that would be great if you operate the slides since you already have it, and it lets us get right into the issues. So thank you, folks, for joining today. Would it make sense for us to kind of just do a very quick, like roundtable of the folks that are on the call, because it's a small group. It might make sense for us to kind of just get to know each other.
I think
I'll
that's a
start.
great idea. Yeah.
Okay, thanks. I'll start. This is Dave Marr from Qualcomm. I historically have led the open source group, the legal team at Qualcomm, and increasingly we've been getting closer into the AI and data set stuff. So we also pulled that into our scope as well now. Maybe I should call on names. Andrew, can I ask you to jump in with an introduction? Why don't we have anybody jump in with their introduction, since it's possible that folks might be in transit, not able to unmute.
Yeah, hi there. Stephen Pollard here. Actually working with Andrew from Orcro. I'm really interested in the question of, okay, so how do we define what good capabilities mean in terms of managing open source risk? So very interested in understanding how AI fits into that today.
Great, thank you. Thank you, Stephen. Anyone else?
This is Brian Adams here. I'm also from Qualcomm, like Dave. Similarly, my background has historically been in open source compliance and strategy. But similar to Dave, over the past year or so, we've been instrumental in spinning up processes and policies and strategies in the AI space. I'm really excited to be part of this group and work with you all.
Thank you, Brian.
Anyone else? Go next.
Thanks, Tiffany.
My name is Tiffany Georgievsky. I'm an IP and data privacy attorney at Sony, specifically supporting our AI ethics groups.
Great. Thanks, Tiffany. Anyone else?
Hi, this is Andrew Capps here. Sorry, can you hear me okay?
Yeah. Hey, Andrew. We can hear you.
Yeah, hi Dave. Yeah, so sorry about that. I'm out of the state of open at the moment, and for some reason my phone seems to think I'm driving, so it's very reluctant to let me turn my video on. Yeah, so I'm Andrew Capps. I'm a lawyer. I've been advising on free and open source software for many, many years. I've been heavily involved in the OpenChain project from pretty close to its inception. So I'm the author, for example, of the OpenChain template open source policy, and I'm going to be taking over the chairmanship of the education work group in April. So I also run an open source compliance consultancy called Orcro. Stephen is one of my colleagues. Yeah, this is an area that we're very interested in getting involved with, because the students have a maturity model that we're working on. I think there's a lot of aspects of AI that are relevant to that. So sorry for speaking so much.
Not at all. Thank you, Andrew. And that was a great introduction. Appreciate that. Jeff, I think that you were unmuting for a moment there.
Yep, I was just going to introduce myself. Jeff Cuddle. I work with Dave and Brian in the groups they discuss, but specifically have been spearheading a lot of the data analyses in the larger kind of AI context.
Thanks, Jeff. Anyone else?
So maybe it's my turn.
Yes. Hey, Jerry.
Should I go? Okay, yeah, I'm Jari, and my background is in open source due diligences for M&A and in OSPOs, and I'm really interested to see where the AI is taking our compliance things, etc. So that's why I'm joining here.
Great. Welcome, Jari. Sorry for messing up your name.
Yeah, this is Victor Liu. I'm an independent consultant based in Tampa, Florida. Just interested in AI and security.
Great. Welcome. Can you say your first name again?
Victor.
Victor. Okay, great. Thanks, Victor. And since you already turned on his video, I'll go ahead and turn mine on as a proper host. So thank you guys for joining today. This is our third meeting. We've had a couple meetings already, not counting an organizing meeting, and we kind of have this alternating approach to try to include everybody globally on this conversation. So for kind of the kickoff meeting, we had two flavors of it, one in North America / Europe, and then another one in Europe / Asia. So in terms of things that we covered there, the agenda was actually, it was pretty simple. We asked some high-level questions around what are the things that are worth going into. And then, relative to this approach, we're kind of having these meetings on pretty much a weekly basis with some, not counting the alternations. So then things we talked about were like, what are the goals? What's the background for this discussion? We had discussions in Bilbao. We had the conversations that happened in Tokyo. Folks that raised, topics of conversation include things like safety bias. And a key question that was asked was, how do we create trust in the upstream AI models? And what about for AI data? Different folks, including folks that are on the call right now, at various points, chimed in. There were some comments around there was a broad lack of understanding of the ethics aspects of AI, and there may be a need to standardize what is a balanced data set, leveraging prior work done. And I think that I won't say names because I don't want to speak for people, but there were comments from some folks in Europe around making sure we leverage the prior work done in terms of compliance in this space. And then as to the data sets, a recognition that the data sets was a key ingredient of the AI ecosystem. Whether to just focus on open source, the comments there seem to be around, well, if we solve for open source, then that's really a superset of the proprietary. And so we end up solving for that too. But our focus should be, just like with OpenChain, on the open source aspects. And then there was some discussions about the different dimensions that we should be considering, like 4 pieces: UI, model, weights, and data. There was some discussion in reference to other conversations happening in other places, things like defining what is open AI, and that maybe we shouldn't be trying to duplicate those conversations. And then some discussions around ways to keep us organized. So if that's a reasonable recap of the discussion points so far, let me just pause there, see if anybody thought that there was anything that might be additive, or maybe I didn't cover quite right. Okay. And by the way, just everybody, it's a small group, just chime in anytime that you think is, appropriate. So what we have on screen right now is the proposed agenda. I'm sorry, I had this trip, over the, late part of last week, and I might have picked up something. So I'll be clearing my throat from time to time. So I proposed a few pieces to the conversation. One is scope, which would be, how do we actually build trust in the open source AI supply chain? I picked that up from one of the conversational points during the discussion so far. And I added a couple details that I thought might be helpful to guide the conversation, because these are elements that actually helped us build OpenChain in the beginning. And a subpoint there would be, what are compliance artifacts? And another subpoint would be, how do we know they can be trusted? Because after all, this is about building trust in the supply chain. And I want to talk about whether or not, that's inclusive or not inclusive of trust in AI, which is a big macro issue. And then once we sort of get that, those thoughts down, perhaps we can talk about use cases. Those seem to be where the last conversation's kind of finished, and so we can start there. That would be, I think, terrific. So I have a few different use cases put down there. There might be others for us to be looking at and considering. So first, scope. Let's hit that first. Oh, yeah, sorry, there's this slide, and this was intended to help frame the continuity from OpenChain. Thanks, Shane. Yeah, this is a good slide to cover actually at the outset, and then jump back into scope, because with OpenChain we had a very simple but very effective paradigm, and that is, we sit within a integrated ecosystem. There's stuff that's upstream from us, and there's stuff that's downstream from us. Whether you're providing source code or other compliance artifacts simply to provide compliance, and you may not have anybody actually using that code or wanting to tweak your make modifications to your stuff, or even care about the attributions. The fact is, you do have people downstream, and all of us have folks upstream. If you're using open source, you have folks upstream. And so the question is, for OpenChain, what are the things that you need to handle properly and do well enough to some common baseline or even best practice around how you handle those inbound pieces? Do the people have, who are handling those pieces, do they have training? Is there a policy? Is there governance around that? And then is there a reliable process with checks and balances? And then you provide, things on the outbound side, but those are things that in the OpenChain lingo we call compliance artifacts, the things that you're required to do based on the licenses that are on the inbound side. And in the OpenChain world, in the traditional open source world, we have fewer like regulatory, like overriding, requirements. Besides, you just got to follow the license. If you don't follow the license, then you're arguably in breach of the license and potentially violating copyrights, and that would be one of the overriding regulatory frameworks. But with AI, and most AI, by the way, or at least a lot of it, I won't want to offer a statistic, but you have so much of it that is coming in under an open source license. It's natural for folks that are in our discipline to be pulled into that conversation. But then there's a superset of additional things. And those additional things include this huge regulatory cloud that's actually over this area. And those regulatory issues go to all kinds of things that are under the category of, call it AI risk management in different ways. And I'll talk about that on my next slide. But the main purpose of this slide is to sort of underscore that OpenChain's done something really, really amazing here. And that is, it's created a model where you can actually rely commercially reasonably on the things done upstream of you, and use those compliance artifacts without having to duplicate that process that existed prior to you getting that technology, which means that it's efficient. If you can rely on the compliance artifacts as being quality, then you don't have to redo the diligence that happened upstream, and you pass that on downstream as well, creating that continued efficiency throughout the supply chain. So next slide, if we can pivot back to AI. So, those commonalities that we had with OpenChain, I think are important, but there's a bunch of things that are worth at least covering and making sure we understand, is out there. And I don't know that, in my opinion, that OpenChain is in the best position to handle certain things that are actually being handled in all kinds of other places. So, so the AI regulatory framework, it is massive, okay? And there's different permutations of it, but underneath it all are a bunch of concerns. So if you look at the regulatory pieces on the right or the top of this diagram or the slide, you've got the EU AI Act that is just recently published, and what people are thinking is going to be the final form. So that final or near final draft is very comprehensive legislation in the EU, obviously, on AI, and there's a whole bunch of themes that are carried into that are actually consistent with some of the themes in other places as well. EU is kind of ahead of most places as having a integrated and cohesive set of regulations, in that act. China has a number of different requirements and provisions that they pass through a number of different more ad hoc pieces that are intended to be read together, including their generative AI measures that was published last year, their pre-existing deep synthesis provisions, algorithm recommendation provisions, security assessment provisions, CAC, their cybersecurity, the cybersecurity, center. There's an acronym letter that I'm missing there, but they take in your algorithm and they test it to make sure that the output is appropriate for the China demographic. And the U.S. has a number of different things as well. Their executive order, this thing called Blueprint on AI Bill of Rights. The latter one is actually not binding; it's more of a guideline for discussion and for implementation by companies. And then the OECD. OECD is sort of a pan North America, Europe organization, and they've created some comparative studies on different types of AI systems and provided some guidelines for their development. And there's more. Australia's got stuff, Japan's got stuff. A whole bunch of countries are having stuff, and in the U.S., we're having a kind of a problem where all these different states are actually bubbling up their own little views of things. But at the end of the day, thematically, we're talking about all the same things. If you look at what the NIST organization in the U.S. has as to the recommended risk management framework, you have these pieces in there, which is like when you have AI, you need to be safe. You think about how secure is it? If it goes down, how resilient is it to come back up? Is the algorithm explainable? Is the output interpretable? Are the privacy issues addressed? So that you can't have perfect privacy solutions, but have you actually addressed those, enhanced those, and mitigated those issues? And then fairness. This stuff is that's generative AI anyway. It's basically a derivation of all kinds of subsets and supersets of data that pre-existed. A lot of it was scrapings from the internet, and so you have all the human biases reflected in all that data set. And people try to debias the data, they try to debias the models, but you can't actually have zero bias. Humans don't have zero bias, and the data sets we generate don't have zero bias. So as a result, how do you manage that bias? And are the different types of bias harmful? And how do you address for those more acute issues? But that's fairness, okay? And then all 5 of those pieces in the U.S. framework anyway would be, they only matter if the model actually performs as intended. Are the results valid? Are the results valid within a certain variance and i.e. reliable? And then none of that to the left matters if you don't have the thing on the right. And this is again the NIST framework. And the relationship between these bubbles, they vary between the regulatory frameworks in each area, each jurisdiction. Every set of legislation has its own way of looking at this stuff. And you have other risk management frameworks as well. But I want to cover these things, just because I want to say this is stuff that's out there. But the right side of this says accountable and transparent. And that's basically saying, if you don't have an owner, that says, that you can go to and say, there's an issue with this AI model, then you have a model that doesn't have accountability. And then transparency, it goes to a couple different things. Some people talk about data transparency, knowing the data set. But the way that this is framed, it's a little bit more ambiguous, as to whether or not there's an overlap with explainable and interpretable. But for now, let's talk about transparency in the context of data transparency, i.e. training data set transparency. So without accountability and transparency, then the NIST framework actually considers the AI to be not risk managed, so that it has to be that element satisfied, even if you had a fully reliable, fully valid, fully explainable, and all the other things, addressed. If you don't have an owner, that's a fatal flaw. So that's the RMF, okay, risk management framework for, in the US at least, published by NIST. And when I look at the other RMFs in other places, these bubbles are basically all the same bubbles. But the way that this is addressed, it's just it's more an issue of execution. And there's many groups out there, including ML Commons and other projects as well, that are addressing these issues. And I think that addressing these issues may not necessarily play to OpenChain strengths. We should certainly talk about them because I think it helps and informs our conversation. But the same way that, in a way, OpenChain is agnostic on licenses, it's the licenses are the set of requirements that come in. This, for our AI handling, I believe that we can be agnostic on what framework it is. So that's, let me just offer that up as a thought. But I've been talking a lot. Let me pause and see if folks have other thoughts. I do have another chart to cover, but only if we have time. The scoping conversation I thought is kind of important. So I'll continue for a little bit more. So, whether or not something is sufficiently risk managed, whether something is, sufficiently open, whether something is particularly like ethical or considered to be responsible. I don't think that we ignore those issues or punt on those issues, but my postulate for you is that within the degrees of responsibility, within the degrees of open, and where those conversations are happening elsewhere, I think that's great. But within the supply chain, we need to be able to deal with a diverse set of different things, because a lot of times our companies or our roles may not necessarily be the end system delivery. And so within the end system delivery, it might be, yes, of course, we have to make sure that everything is managed in a responsible and ethical way as that AI system is delivered to, let's say, a customer or the public, or made available to someone as a functioning system. But during the development cycle, at various points, the thing may not be ready for prime time. It may not be ready for public use, and as a result, those other things, they should be handled, and it would be handled. But as to the compliance artifacts, meaning in the AI space, if you want to disclose the data sets, what is a good way to do that? If you wanted to provide the model card, what's a good way to do that? This might be a good moment for me to pull in any comments from others as well. Brian, I saw that you unmuted.
Yeah, thanks, Dave. You brought up a really interesting point about trying to be agnostic here, and I think you're hitting on a key concept, which is there are an ever-growing body of requirements legally and community norms, really. And I think it's going to be challenging for this team to try to capture everything. But at the same time, I think it's important that we are flexible to support all of those various inputs. And one thing I wanted to pose to the group is, to what extent does it make sense to have these, the compliance artifacts contain mandatory versus voluntary fields? And just to provide some more background, something I've been thinking about is if you make something voluntary, of course, or excuse me, if you make something mandatory, of course, it's going to exist in the artifact, which is great, but you might be forcing someone to put in less than ideal data points, just trying to do their best. Whereas if it's voluntary, potentially downstream users could have even greater confidence in the accuracy or the content because they know someone actually went above and beyond to say this is in my product or this is in my AI system. And on the, and complementary to that, if there's an explicit disclaimer saying we don't know this key piece of information, just heads up, we are unable to answer this, and that could be either because it's not possible to find out, or maybe there's hesitation for strategic reasons, or for business reasons, or for compliance reasons. So I just want to pose that to the group if anyone has thoughts about the mandatory versus voluntary aspects of this.
Yeah, thanks, Brian. Let me pause to see if other folks have a comment to that.
I think that's an excellent point. If I can come in, I think and Dave, thank you so much for that. That was really interesting background. I think one distinction that we have here, and if we're talking about compliance artifacts, the compliance artifacts arise from the fact that we have open source software, which is contains a number of components. Each one of those components is licensed, and it's the license requirements themselves that determine what the compliance artifacts need to be for a particular version of shipping product. But then, of course, it's also the use case as well. And the use case, so for example, if we're going back to sort of traditional open chain license compliance questions, then if you're looking at something where the use case is for use in a SaaS environment, then the compliance artifacts are necessarily going to be different from those compliance artifacts which will be provided if you are shipping and distributing the software, or indeed if you're putting it into an embedded system. So I think it's quite difficult at this stage to get too prescriptive in terms of what the compliance artifacts need to be, or maybe I'm missing the point here, because ultimately, in the same way that with OpenChain license compliance, we're looking at the use case. In this case, do we mean that if we're looking at the production and shipping of a particular AI model, for example, we're going to be saying that essentially the out license is that it's intended to be compatible with, for example, the EU regulation, or with the NIST risk management framework, because that's going to drive, I think, what we think the specific compliance artifacts are going to be. And as I say, this is sort of a barely formed thought, but I'm just trying to get my head around the concepts at the moment.
It's a well-formed thought. Thank you, Andrew. I fully follow that. Let me see if I can talk through, at least and impress some initial thoughts on that. Wait, are we getting close to time?
No, we've got plenty of time. Don't worry. We can.
Okay.
The hour is blocked technically, so we can keep going.
Oh, okay. All right. Great. Thanks. All right. So relative to the use cases and the way it's being deployed. If we were to use this NIST AI framework, and we wouldn't be using it, let's say, in Europe, we wouldn't be using it in Asia, but I'm just using it as a starting point to capture some of those factors. These factors actually are only really required when a model is delivered, to the public or to a customer, right? When you're in the development cycle and delivering to, let's say, an OEM, that's not the sort of end user of the AI system. It's not an AI system that's deployed yet. So it would just be a component. And as a result, you're not actually obligated to do all these things. It's only when you have an AI system that say, okay, people can actually start using this AI system now, then at that point it applies. If you've got some pilot internal deployment, then you probably have to do some things, but until you actually have a delivered AI system, you don't really have the RMF, risk management framework applying. So, but in order to actually, if you're, let's say, providing, let's say I want to stand up a SaaS model and provide some chatbot, on the internet. I can only do my RMF work, the risk management work on all these factors here, if I know what's actually built into the software. So the equivalent of an SBOM for AI. But instead of just knowing the the components, I also need to be thinking about what are the intended uses of that, right? So there's some data sets intended for certain things, there's some models intended for certain things, and all those things accumulate, in terms of how suitable those are for for the risk management. So if you think about an SBOM, you've got on the AI side, you've got a system, and then once you know the software bill of materials, you have a piece of it. But if your software bill of materials says, I got this model Llama 2, from Meta, and and you don't know what went into Meta in terms of the training process. That might put you sort of behind the 8 ball in certain areas where, in certain countries, for example, they've been playing with legislation that says you must also disclose a training data set. And we're not here to sort of create policy on this in terms of like international governance policy. We're here to try to provide what is it an efficient vehicle for AI compliance artifact delivery. So it would be models tend to have these things called model cards. Data cards are also provided with most data sets these days. And so those would be additional compliance artifacts I would propose that would be brought into this conversation. And then coming back to Brian's point, I think his point's informed by the observation that AI today, it's very immature in terms of an efficient supply chain. In fact, I would argue that it's probably very inefficient, because so much work that's being done at these different levels are actually very redundant work, because people are, frankly, at this point within the existing regulatory risks, not so willing to share some key data elements. And so when those data elements are missing, how then do we actually cause those to be required or not required? And how much pushback do we actually provide at different tiers of the ecosystem?
Yeah, Dave, I just want to follow up a couple more thoughts on that. So I think when something's missing, I think it's important that it's conveyed as intentionally missing, as opposed to just an oversight, just to give downstream users awareness of what's in or not in AI. And to draw parallels, talk about SBOMs. I think another interesting point we need to consider is that in the AI space, both from a regulatory perspective and just from community norms, if you look at, say, Hugging Face repositories, so much of the data is not objective, it's almost subjective. And I think we need to be cognizant of that, so that if we're requiring, or if we're recommending that to be compliant in an artifact, you have something that's a intended use or bias. That's something that is difficult to measure or objectively test or be 100% confident in. But we still want to encourage that behavior, to say that this is a excluded use. This is the intended use. And have that passed along down the supply chain, so that if someone picks up a model, they know, okay, this one is probably not appropriate to run the electrical grid, versus, okay, this one's probably fine because we're just generating end user entertainment content, for example.
Yeah, thank you, Brian. I should mention that Brian, within my company, Brian is actually the genuine subject matter expert in the area of AI models and AI systems overall, from a legal perspective. So I'm glad that Brian's here on this call to join that. My focus, frankly, has been on the pieces I'm arguing are less relevant, which is on the regulatory side, the legal framework for things, on like the EU AI Act and other things like that. So I'm gonna be steered more by Brian's comments, and I would ask Brian if he can continue to stay active and help lead this. And meanwhile, by the way, Jeff Kettle is our lead on AI training data sets, as mentioned. So the intentionality of not including things, that's a difficult one for us, right? Because that creates that creates a inefficiency in the process, and yet we have to accommodate the realities of how AI is being currently delivered. I think we deal with the world as it exists, which is we have to allow some degree of voluntariness, in those disclosures until there's other overriding norms that take over. What were your thoughts on that, Brian, or other people?
I'll pause here. See if anyone has any comments, because I could talk a while on this topic.
I can chime in here. I think it'd be interesting to know kind of goes back to scoping and what's the goal. And I'm new to OpenChain in general, so let me know if it's kind of already established. But for me, is the goal just to create like an ecosystem where, hey, we have a framework where whatever kind of information you want to disclose, or is the goal to actually, say, well, when you're grabbing something and it says X, Y, it's compliant with OpenChain, at least I know that it has a certain level of information that I can look at. Is this going to be intended for engineers? Should be accessible for engineers to be able to figure out if something is compliant and going to meet the needs, for example, of the EU AI Act in terms of transparency disclosures? Or is this going to be something that we expect people to also have their legal counsel looking at and in the details to help them select a model? Clearly I'm a fan of the self-serve, let engineers play around in a safe space where they can explore the different type, as we talk about what are trustworthy and say, yes, anything that meets this criteria at least should have a certain level of information. Because otherwise we're kind of back to just the wild, wild west. Why aren't we just, people are just going to grab models off of a lot of other sources, right? If there is no kind of guarantee that there's at least a certain level of transparency. So I would be more in favor, of saying, there is at least some information that we need. There's probably going to be lots of types of information and disclosures that could be voluntary that would be helpful. So for example, about the limitations and the bias, because those can be use specific, because those can vary, right? In some cases, you want real world bias to be reflected in a model. In other cases, that would be detrimental. So, but I think the conversation of what we're getting at, well, sometimes, people don't want to share information. Well, I think that to me undermines the first point that we talked about of how do we establish something trustworthy? And for me, from a practical perspective, it's a lot easier if we know that we're working in a framework that doesn't require lawyers to be involved at every step to help evaluate that trustworthiness.
Yeah, I fully resonate with those points. It's there's so much work in this area that still is kind of still nascent and still needs to be addressed. Brian, do you want to respond to Tiffany's points?
Yeah, I think you're spot on. If nothing is mandatory, then this sort of falls apart. So we definitely need to have a hook and an anchor here. I'm just trying to throw out there the notion that potentially quality is superior to quantity in this case, and to the extent we can have confidence in the data points in the artifacts, I think that could be superior than a laundry list of best attempts. But I do think it's a harmony somewhere in between the two. It's not going to be all in one or the other. Yeah, great points.
I think my impression is that a lot of these things are informed by two things. One is how much effort people want to deliver in this area. It may be it's to Tiffany's point. There's a lot of models out there. There's thousands of models on for example that Hugging Face, and the compliance with good disclosures on the model cards, like what went into this model and what is it intended for. It's just all over the map. It's any one of us on the call right now, we had the wherewithal in the system, we could actually just train a model overnight and then and put it up. And so it really does feel like the very early days of open source, where you had people just kind of hacking away in their garage and then throwing up code and say, I wrote this last week, and is it useful? So, and then you have licenses that are just kind of like very, very kind of hacked together, stream of consciousness licenses that we see very little of now. So the normative practices just aren't there yet. You see a lot of people comply with the recommended frameworks that Google or Hugging Face have actually put out there, but it's just all over the map. And and also to Brian's point, there's a lot of like essential core data that's missing. And how much do you actually go back and push back and ask people to go back and explain what those missing ingredients are?
I would recommend it's either in a later meeting, we all either come with some homework done or have a working session to kind of come up with a superset of what are the various data points and the artifacts for model cards, for data cards that, put it all on the table and say, this is the world of information that's useful. And then talk about it on an individual basis, which ones are key and critical that we should make mandatory, which ones are nice to have that we can make voluntary. And in the latter bucket, to the extent someone can comply, here's the proper way to do it so that people have confidence in the information.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And I see Victor has a comment there. Any public info on what we are missing, on what's missing from these? I don't see any studies on this. There was a study back some years ago about how, in the area of model cards and compliance artifacts in this space, there was a lack of normative approaches, and there have been some work, around that, some discussions anyway around that. But let me see if I can pull up, a couple references, offline and respond to Victor's point. So Brian suggested that we go offline and come back with some additional conversation on this point as well. But where my head's at right now, just sort of to put it down as a moment, or a marker, is that because there's so many different practices around this stuff, and because it's frankly not a well normatively defined space, with not even short of like standards, like formal standards, we don't even really have a reliable set of de facto standards, like regular normative behaviors that are completely voluntary. I think we have to be able to have a framework that's flexible enough to say, these are the compliance artifacts such as they are. And these are the model cards that I have, and here's the way that I'm complying with them by providing transparency to you downstream people. This is the original sources that I have, and here they are. And that feels like the old days of open source, like the README files, right? It's like, I scan for license, I grok for license, rep for license across, my entire, source code base. And I pulled up all the different licenses and I concatenated them into one big massive file. And here you are. It's not useful to you whatsoever because you can't process that information in connection with any type of useful SBOM. But I comply with the licenses literally because I duplicated them, and here they are in this giant README. So it feels a little bit like we're in that stage right now on AI, and how people then end up doing that, whether it's in a README or other thing. That's, and where you put it, back in the early days of open source, it was like we put it in the root directory, but is that the right spot? And so if we take the world as it is, then it's carrying that work that was previously done downstream and providing it, and maybe then over time we try to build out more efficient systems that allow machine processing for some of this stuff, and easier searchability for key data sets as to whether or not those are being used, and then a way to memorialize this information, right? So we should probably have someone from SPDX talk about some of their profiles as a point and reference, as to how they're handling these things, because they've done fair amount of work as to how to create a system that has a format for dropping in these data points. Okay, Shane, can I ask that we move on to the next slide? All right, so in terms of the conversation for use cases now. So, and Andrew already kind of alluded to this, there's a big difference between a SaaS provided use case where you basically you put a model up on a website and people can interact with it there and get output based on perhaps their prompts or other types of input that's otherwise interacting with the model. And then there's also like delivering the model itself. Here you go. This is this is a discrete piece of software. It's in an app or something, and it's going to run on your phone or some other end user device. And I put these points together to try to kind of talk about a framework for a conversation about use cases. But if you start from the left, you have you collect data sets from different places, and as I mentioned, you might have, let's say, some large scraping of let's say images, or you might have some collection of business writings, or you might have books, or you might have the archives of Reddit. But you take the data sources, put them together, and you say, okay, this is now my training data set. And you might create a data card in connection with that. And that data card might be a collection and I'm so sorry. It might be a concatenation of all the different data cards that you pulled in for your training data set, as a superset. And then, so working from the left, then the data set goes into this box there. That's really, where you're actually developing and potentially even deploying the model. But the model would get trained. And then when the model actually then is deployed, then it's providing inferences. So let's use a generative AI, example. Let's just say let's say a chatbot, for example. So then if you have it deployed, let's say on a SaaS model, then this is what this, this diagram is intended to actually describe. So you're hosting it here, and a user is putting in prompts and then getting responses. That's interaction on top. And then those responses are the inferences coming from the model. Sometimes some models are actually deployed in such a way that it takes the input and then it uses that and basically calls it, back propagates that as an incremental training set, and enhances the model, at intervals, so that as that model, revs, then it's informed by the additional prompts and the series of prompts that has been provided. So, I lost the video. Okay, it's there again. Okay. So the model would have these model cards that would be connected to it, and that's basically like it's almost like a robust README, which is like this is how to use this model, and all the different pieces of it. Sorry, there might be some background noise. The house is waking up. The different pieces of it, might get memorialized in the model card that we've actually been talking about in the prior conversation. But then if the model is not deployed by the developer in a SaaS model, then you might actually end up taking the model and delivering that to somebody. Maybe it gets delivered as a component to a larger system for somebody else to build out. Maybe you have API access to something that is running with a hybrid cloud backend. So there's many ways that you instantiate, the availability of the AI, the inferencing capability. And then the second point here is, that's not the same Brownian motion problem. That's in reference to the way that with open source, you have people taking different pieces of little snippets of logic from source code and pulling that into different Git repos and other repositories. And so it's very easy to get a number of different licenses that get inferred into a even a single file. So with respect to models themselves, because it's a significant and almost like a monolithic activity to actually train that model. You don't get models that actually cross-pollinate with other models as easily, simply because the training aspect is such a big component of the development of the model itself. And once it's developed, then you can do some additional training on it, but really it's kind of intact as this is the model. Whereas on the data set side, you do have a lot of small motions. Okay, it's easy and super easy actually to grab little pieces of data from one place and say, okay, I took all the facial recognition training data sets here, and I just wanted to train for senior citizens. And so you then superset it for call it the more experienced faces and put them into another subset of data sets. So it requires no training. It's basically just and it can be manual copy paste activity. So you have a lot of Brownian motion between data sets. You have very little Brownian motion between AI models. And as to the comparison as to the licenses, I would say you have very interesting licenses on the AI and dataset side. I've seen more creativity on the AI side, but they would take things like some bits from the Apache 2 license, and then they add all kinds of other things to it, and say sometimes you see provisions that are very difficult for a lawyer to actually look at and say this is how I enforce it, or this is how I comply with it. So almost too much creativity on the model licensing side. But if you look at these use cases, then there's different pieces of it. You've got okay, so you've got the use cases that you talked about in the prior call: creating LLMs, consuming generated AI, and distributing generated AI. Okay, so so if we take all the embedded AI stuff and set that aside for now, and just talk about large language models, that might be a good place for us to start. But if there's a different starting point that other folks might want to consider, we can do that. Oh, just a note that we need to close in 5 minutes to allow the monthly call to start. Sure, yeah. This might be a good point for us to wrap up then, actually. If we agree that that there's the use case for this and basically we're looking on the right-hand side of this chart, okay? And we're looking at the user interacting on a SaaS model with an LLM. We're looking at the delivery of the LLM, and then we're looking at the creation of the LLM, the training piece of it. I do think that we should also talk about the creation of the data set itself, the building of the training data set as an additional use case. But if folks are okay with us stopping here, this might be a good moment. Let me pause for any additional feedback or things that people want to see on a future agenda. Okay.
Hey Dave, Jeff here. Obviously,
yeah.
Just from the data side of it, you didn't talk about potential distribution of the data set, just kind of the ingestion and training of it, and whether we need to potentially include that.
Right.
Even as a compliance aspect of a license. So just wanted to bring that up.
Yeah. Thank you, Jeff. To Jeff's point, I went through a narrative where the developer of the model also curated the data set. But the reality is that there are people that are just in the business of curating data sets, for many different purposes, for many different types of models that might be trained from it. So we should talk about the distribution of data sets, as well as an ingredient in the AI supply chain. All right, thank you, Jeff. Okay, with that, we'll go ahead and wrap up this call. Appreciate you guys joining.
Thank you, Dave. That was
Thanks,
fantastic.
Dave.
And the recording will be available soon. So we should have it within about 24 hours out to everyone. For those who want to join the monthly call, the link is in the chat, and you should also find it in your calendars. Once again, Dave, thank you so much for chairing this and taking us to this stage. We're well along the path in scoping now.
Appreciate it.
Fantastic. Thanks, everyone. Thanks, Dave. Okay, bye all.
Thanks, everyone. Bye-bye.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you.